Hello, welcome to our second session on John Wayne Gacy, the Killer Clown. Hopefully you can hear me. If you can hear me and see me, just give me a thumbs up in the comments and do let me know if there's any technical issues your end. But everything's all looking okay this end. Right, so without further ado, we're going to start tonight. What I want to talk to you about is some psychological theories that actually are psychodynamic. Also, don't forget there's also called psychoanalytic theories. Now, these aren't necessarily taught in A-level psychology and certainly not in Access to HE. So these are theories that you can use if you're studying psychology. You can use these theories to help evaluate within your assignments, depending on what it is you're writing about. So frustration aggression theory. This was a theory back in 1939 by Dollard et al. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at this theory, going to explore it, and then we're going to apply it to John Wayne Gacy and see whether that actually helps explain his behaviour for his really absolutely heinous crimes. I did some more research and reading on this I won't say gentleman, but on this killer last night, and I literally scared myself silly. Incredibly dangerous man. So anyway, let's dive in. To define frustration aggression hypothesis, it's a psychodynamic theory of catharsis. So this is kind of like the process of relieving the frustration that the individual feels but by way of aggression. So this kind of like the aggression is the result of the emotional conflict. So it's externalized, it goes outwards. Okay. There's a lot of Freudian theory. Hi, Jay. Hi, Emmy. That's great. All good. Lovely to see you again this evening. Thank you for joining. So again, we're kind of we're going from the basis of Freud, as Freud with his, if we remember in our previous sessions that we've done on John Wayne Gacy and also with Charles Manson, we looked at Thanatos and Eros, so our death drive and our life force drive. Hi, Emmy. So Freud believed that the sort of Thanatos and Eros were our innate and primitive drives that all humans possess. And the Eros is all about kind of ensuring our food and safety and shelter. Okay, so it's all about survival. So the death drive, the anger is projected outwards towards others. So it's externalized, okay? And if it's projected inwards, then it's internalized. Hopefully you can remember this from our previous sessions. Life force, Eros, is all about how we kind of we cooperate within society and within our social circles because we need to survive. We need to make sure that we've got supplies of food and shelter. On a humanistic kind of level, as humans, we need to live within social norms. We need to live within social groups in order to survive. This is what Freud believed. Okay, so this is our kind of basis for frustration aggression hypothesis. Okay, so Freud believed that the emotional conflict was resolved via frustration aggression. So when we look at Thanatos, this is where we're coming from. Okay, so this was a kind of cathartic act. So it brought relief and kind of released all that pent up emotional conflict that the person felt within themselves. So kind of a bit like, you know, when something really, really drives you mad and you get so angry and frustrated and you kind of vent it out and then you've got it off your chest, so you feel better. Okay, so that's the basis of where we're going with this. But obviously within criminal psychology, it manifests and externalized outwards with rather sort of often tragic and disastrous consequences. So Freud believed that if we are able to express this frustration through aggression, so this could be either physical aggression or verbal aggression, that we would feel better through this whole experience of this kind of emotional release from our frustrations. Okay. So Dollard et al., 1939, very old theory. Now, this theory originally was applied to explain animal behaviour, and then later was kind of expanded and worked on to include human behaviours. So we always, and it sounds odd, but we always start, I mean, even behaviourism with classical conditioning as well, we all start with animals first, because what we're looking at really is the amygdala, our fight or flight response, okay, and how humans differ in the fight or flight response to animals, okay. So we're a lot more complex, obviously. So this is where we're coming from, is how does the brain kind of react to fear, trauma, and sort of pent up frustration. This is what this theory is looking at. Okay, so Dollar's proposed that if we experience these frustrations, that this would inevitably lead to the expression of frustration through aggression. So it kind of, this is a deterministic theory. It's saying if you are frustrated, you will definitely project outwards through aggression. Just reading what Jay's just said, kind of makes sense if channeled in the correct manner, expressing anger. Absolutely, absolutely. We'll get to that in a minute. You're ahead of me. You're on the ball tonight, Jay. Yeah, absolutely. This is what we're going to kind of evaluate as we go through this. And I'm going to try and teach you these tips on evaluation as well. Even just if you just have an interest in this, you don't need to be studying it, but if you're studying it, it's a bonus. Okay. So he's Dollard et al. They kind of believe that this was the be all and end all, that you would, if you had this pent up frustration, it would come out as aggression. Okay, and that would be kind of like a cathartic process for that individual, and gave them relief and release from the kind of inner turmoil of frustration. Now, when we think of Gacy, we can kind of see that he probably spent an awful lot of his, I would say, his adolescence and his sort of young adulthood with this frustration kind of really, really building up, because it had been building up from childhood. But we're going to have a look again in a moment at Gacy regards this theory. So we got kind of like a two-tier aggression release, okay? So the only way that they believe the only way to relieve this frustrations, to engage in an activity that allows that individual to sort of release the aggression, relieving the frustration. Okay, so there's two tiers to it. There's sublimation. Okay, so the aggression is kind of released in a socially acceptable way through sports. You know, it might be a real, like a contact sport like rugby, something that really gets the adrenaline going, and releases all that pent up energy. Okay, so this is a socially acceptable way of doing things. The other tier is displacement. Okay, so this is the direction of the aggression is projected outwards, so it kind of, it's impacting another individual. The aggression is targeted to another individual or property, okay, or it could even be animals in a very violent manner. Okay, so if we think kind of think about the antisocial behaviour, which I'm getting to in a minute. Dollard, they believe that the frustration was born from the inability or prevention of goal achievement. So if we think about John Wayne Gacy's father, so this is kind of, you kind of link back and think about his childhood. So John Wayne Gacy's father, quite a brute of a man, okay, and his whole frustration with his son was the fact that his son, John Wayne Gacy, did actually have a heart problem as well. The child was overweight and preferred to play, to do cooking and gardening, and very, very feminine, and was kind of known as a bit of a mama's boy, So John Wayne Gacy's father had a huge amount of pent up frustration there towards his son. in actual fact, to his entire family. He was an absolute brute. So this would come out as aggression towards his son. So it's kind of transgenerational. This, I believe, that's my kind of take on this. This is kind of this behaviour, and we'll look at learning theory in a minute, has actually gone down through the generations. Because if we look at John Wayne Gacy's father, he's learnt that behaviour from somewhere as well. Okay, so within John Wayne Gacy's father's his beliefs and kind of moral norms for him was that, you know, boys should be men, you know, that, you know, you kind of, you take a beating like a real man, and you do real man sports, and you do real man activities. You know, you don't do anything that's slightly feminine, because if you did, you're a sissy. So that's the kind of like, that's our background that we're working from when we look at this theory. Okay, so in many circumstances, Dollard argues that it's not always possible for the person to attack the source of frustration. So when we're thinking of things like abstract things like lack of money, okay, or the punishment, the risk of punishment is too high, so you can't, you know. So if you were a law-abiding person, you wouldn't be projecting your anger in a physical way towards police, etc., if you thought that something was unfair and you were frustrated about something. Okay, so this meant that the aggression could not be projected onto that source. Okay, so our examples here with frustration, aggression, if you can't, so say you can't physically attack the lack of money. Okay, but we would see this with ASBOs, with antisocial behaviour, with socio-economic deprivation and poverty, that in some, not all, but in some circumstances, people will become very angry at those who have wealth, and maybe attack people's property and behave in an antisocial manner. So you can kind of apply that theory there as well. So yeah, so it's kind of projected if they can't attack the source of the frustration. So in Gacy's case, he was unable to attack his own father, for example. He wouldn't have been able to attack the person that sexually assaulted him as a child. He would not have been he's not able to express his homosexual desires and tendencies. Okay, so he cannot physically or even verbally attack the source of his frustration. Okay, so it's kind of building up over the years through adolescence. So the psychological need here is basically for release from the frustration and the aggression. That's the vehicle with which is used to release this frustration. There's one other thing I thought of, it's just gone straight out of my head, but I'll remember it again in a minute. So yeah, so he's unable to express himself as a child because he's not in a safe environment. He can't challenge his father over the way he behaves towards him. And just as a little bit more background, his father was quite a violent alcoholic and would physically attack his mother and his siblings. So Gacy was not actually even able to, because of his father's attitude towards how he felt his son should be and act, it wasn't even a safe thing to tell his father or even anybody in his family, his immediate family, of what happened to him. Now, this sexual assault by a family friend was apparently around, there's conflicting reports as to whether it was age 9 or age 7. So that's really quite horrendous to think that he wasn't able to tell anybody. Although there'll be a caveat in a minute, there always is with me. So yeah, so a frustration, aggression applied to Gacy. So when we think of, I don't know if anybody, I don't know if you, Emmy or Jay, if you ever studied psychology, if you've looked at Erik Erikson and his psychosocial stages of development. I mean, I have talked about that a little bit with Charles Manson, but there's a certain stage in what Erickson defines as our developmental stages through life, identity versus confusion. So at this point, Gacy is not able to express his homosexual tendencies and his, that's him, that's who he is. He's not allowed to express that. He has to suppress it. And then he marries a woman to please his father. That's our application of this theory to Gacy. There are reports that Gacy was actually, in fact, bisexual. And none of this can be completely and utterly verified. The flip side of that is that actually Gacy was a very dangerous psychopath. You have, Emmy. That's great. Yeah. So you'll know what I mean about identity versus confusion. Yeah. So basically, the formative years really for building identity of the self is teenage. It's the adolescence stages going into young adulthood. So you know how your teenagers, like, 1 minute they're like one band, usually around about 12, 13 years old, this kind of starts. And then they start, actually, I don't like that anymore. And it's the same with food. It's the same with friends, clothing, music, everything. Okay. So they kind of chop and change, because they're basically feeling their way through different kind of experiences to build their own identity and to find out who they are, what they're about, and how they actually fit into society. So adolescence for John Wayne Gacy was not yeah. Yeah, Emmy, you've been through the same as me. Oh my goodness. Yeah. We won't go there, but yeah, the charity shop got a lot of clothing that was barely worn. As I think we've all experienced that one. So he's not able to kind of navigate this natural psychosocial process, because his father's trying to carve him into something that he wants to see, so that he makes him look good. Oh, look at my son, he's such a man, and Gacy's like, actually, that's not really who I am, and I can't fit in. We also kind of need to which we'll look at in a minute, we need to kind of think about how Gacy was growing up with his attachments, which we'll have a look at later on in this lecture. So Jay, helpful if you have a supporting family to find secure identity, which didn't. You're absolutely right. Yeah. So we kind of like, we're always, and I'm always banging on about attachment theory and how important it is. And it is because you need the secure attachment. Okay. It doesn't have to be, as we discovered with Freud and Dan in 1951 with their study on the 6 orphans from the concentration camp. It does not need to be necessarily with a parent. If you've got a secure attachment with another role model, so it could be extended family member, or it could be a very close friend, or an auntie or something. If you've got that there, then that is sufficient to help you navigate some of these processes successfully and actually build you build your kind of moral development and how you see the world, how you perceive the world around you. It kind of gives you this safe vessel in which to travel. Okay. So it's really, really vital. So we can always take these I don't think there's one serial killer. I may be wrong, but I don't think there's one serial killer that hasn't had some kind of attachment issue in childhood. So that doesn't mean that every person who has had an attachment problem in childhood becomes a serial killer, because we know there's many other facets involved in this. So he's kind of got this. From this, we can kind of assume, and we are just assuming this because and this is the other thing, is that serial killers will not tell you a lot about themselves, because that's part of the control. Okay, so but we can assume with what we know about John Wayne Gacy that he would have felt a deep sense of frustration. Okay, so this frustration had been festering for many, many years, and overshadowed by the acknowledgement of his father's shame about his son. So Gacy was aware that his son was his father rather was ashamed of him. Okay, so there's kind of like the foot on the gas and the brake at the same time for Gacy, because he's got this frustration which needs to come out as aggression, but also he's trying to hinder that because his father is ashamed of him. He cannot express his frustration at not being able to come out because his father's already deeply ashamed. So this is kind of quite damaging for, especially within adolescence, when with the development of the prefrontal cortex, which I will probably do another session on the adolescent brain soon, just to give you some insight into that. The one thing that we need to remember when we're applying all these theories to explain the intentions and motivations of serial killers such as Gacy, we need to remember that despite everything, despite the abuse that he suffered as a child and the way that his father treated him, he still had a choice. He still has free will. Okay. So he had the free will to choose not to project his aggression onto adolescent and young males in the most horrifying and heinous, inhumane way that he did. He did not have to do that. That was his choice. Okay. So I would also go as far as to conclude that he saw what he saw in these young men. If we are to apply frustration aggression hypothesis here, with a little bit of Carl Jung, if anyone's heard of projection as perception, he saw in those young men, and don't forget, his youngest victim was around 14 years old. He saw them in them. He saw what he despised about himself. Okay, so they were most of them, if not all, were homosexual. Some were prostitutes. Some were runaways. Some were travelers. Okay, they were vulnerable young men in any case, even if they were not homosexual. They were still vulnerable. So Gacy, he recognizes himself in those people. Okay, in his victims, and the aggression is externalized onto them because he cannot confront his father. He cannot come out as gay. He's kind of stalwart in his community. He's a married man. He's a businessman. He's into politics. So at that time as well, this is kind of like in the 60s and 70s. There's that pressure there to maintain social norms, and like I said before, in most countries it was illegal. So he sees in these young men what he actually despises about himself, what he has been trying to suppress, and also those young men kind of represent him as to how his father saw him. Okay, so his father was ashamed of him. So you kind of looking to apply this theory to explain some of the thought processes behind on the subconscious level. Okay, these aren't conscious. These are what we would regard as kind of like unconscious, repressed emotions, which again, that's Freudian, so psychoanalytic, psychodynamic theory there. Okay, so the theories, like I said before, the theories that like within psychodynamic and psychoanalytic theory, it's the same thing, just called two different things either side of the pond, psychoanalytic or psychodynamic, remember. They're non-falsifiable. So again, just a reminder, within science, we cannot prove it, but we cannot disprove it. Okay, so we are looking at theories, and we're looking to find phenomenological kind of evidence. So that is the lived experience. So we're going to be looking, and this is qualitative research. So we're going to be looking to see how many people have actually felt this way, and we count those people up, and then we get from those people, for researching something like this, we would get kind of little snippets about how they felt, their emotions and their thoughts. Okay, and then we would look to see whether there were themes appearing. So this is a common theme amongst, say if we researched and we interviewed 5,000 people, we should start to see some themes. And then what that does is that gives our theory a scientific kind of basis, because on a qualitative point of view. We still can't observe and measure it in a laboratory kind of setting. All right. So this is a deterministic theory. It's just basically by deterministic means because of this, this will happen. Okay, so determinism very similar in the way that reductionism reduces it down to a single source of one cause. You know, I don't know, eating too much sugar causes diabetes. We do know that anyway, but it's just giving you an example. Yeah, so there's only one cause. So that's what we are kind of. If we were to write about this in an assignment, we would really want to evaluate this because it's deterministic. Okay, it's not taking into consideration any other kind of confounding variables, any other factors, any other influences to explain behavior. Okay. So yeah, so we know that the theory proposed is a certain set of circumstances meant that the outcome is inevitable. Okay, so we know this is not the case, not for everybody. Okay, Martin Seligman, you may know of Martin Seligman, learned helplessness and later years positive psychology. He proposed that kind of pent up frustration can lead to depression because the frustration has no outlet there. So it then becomes internalized. So we kind of got to look at it in different facets. Okay. So the idea is that when we apply this theory, it gives us a higher probability, but it's not set in stone. It's not definite. Okay. So in the case of John Wayne Gacy, we have got many, many other contributing factors. And one of them, which is the big one, is psychopathy. Okay, so that's what we need to kind of think of when we're applying this theory. So the projection of aggression, but also responsibility. So the other thing that we need to kind of like consider here is Gacy's. This is the psychopathy side of things. Okay, so his very cold, callous explanation for what happened as being the fault and responsibility of the victims. And like I said, I listened to the tapes of his discussions with his lawyer. And in this, he completely, he appears to have completely externalized not just his aggression, but his responsibility. You know, he projected this onto his victims. So he said that he kind of felt really sorry for them for being so stupid, for putting themselves in that situation in the first place. So there we have this kind of externalization of responsibility, complete blame shift. You know, well, it's their fault. Okay, so these are the kind of, this is obviously, I always go on about psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder. This is good old-fashioned psychopathy. Okay, you'll see this in narcissism as well, but not to this extent. So Berkowitz, he comes along a few years later, 1969, and he looks at Dollard et al.'s theory of frustration aggression, and he says, well, actually, I think that yes, you've got a good point here, but you argued that the frustration does not always lead to the act of aggression. Okay, so instead, that aggression would only be displayed if certain cues were present, triggering the expression of the violent and aggressive behavior. So his cues, the examples that he gave were the kind of like the accessibility of weapons. So if there are weapons there, that could act as a trigger. So if they have access to weapons, it could act as a trigger. Now, we can kind of apply this to some of the, you know, with the school shootings that you've seen in America. So you have a frustration aggression hypothesis there. Okay, so the frustration had built up. We're not going to go too deeply into it, but if we can just apply that to understand that behavior. And so if we were to apply then Berkowitz as well as Dollard, we would say that actually that happened because those guns were accessible. They were there, so they acted as cues. Okay, so that was a cue to the aggression. So Berkowitz also argues that the aggressive inclinations are born from the frustration. Needs to be, you kind of have to have a significant amount of unpleasant feeling and emotion there. So it has to be substantial enough to compel that person to act aggressively. Okay. So this is actually really an important part of evaluating frustration aggression, because if we remember what we just discussed, that frustration aggression was a deterministic theory. It's saying that, you know, if you're frustrated, you're going to act in an aggressive manner. And Berkowitz is saying, no, there has to be a cue present. Yeah. So something like a weapon, excuse me. And that's, you have to feel so awful inside with the unpleasant emotions that are kind of coming from this frustration in order to be able to act aggressively. Okay. There's more. So he further kind of clarified his theory with what he called cognitive neo-association. Now, what he means by this is that the aggression-related stimuli, so that's the source of the frustration, and the aversive occurrences, so this is the incidents that create the build-up of that frustration, which then leads to anger and that emotional conflict. Yeah, it stimulates the aggressive action sort of on an automatic, autonomous kind of basis. So it's kind of like a knee-jerk reaction, as it were. Okay. So the immediate action is to feel incredibly angry. Now, that is normal. This is what he's saying, that, you know, we get angry, we get frustrated with things. And this does, you know, it makes us angry. We wouldn't be human if we didn't feel that, because anger is often seen as a very negative emotion. Okay. So this is what he's saying, that we've all got that there. However, he says that our kind of cognitive awareness, our processes, so this kind of stops us from acting out the aggression. Okay. So if we think about things like moral development, so Kohlberg's theory of moral development, and, you know, so again, secure attachment, being able to navigate the stages of moral development in childhood, being able to successfully navigate adolescence and the prefrontal cortex, so emotional regulation, impulse control, and obviously just discounting the neurobiology as well. But if we're able to navigate all of those processes, then we should have this kind of cognitive braking system, as it were, that steps in and enables that person to halt and control the aggressive reaction. So actually, no, I'm not going to do that, because that's not going to get me anywhere. Okay. So this is, I think that Berkowitz's theory of anger and aggression is far more sensible, shall we say. It's not as deterministic. Okay. So we can evaluate that theory against frustration aggression. Okay. It's certainly kind of, it's, you know, it's all, what he's saying is that it's down to our kind of psychophysiological state at the time, and how we can kind of, I suppose it's in like an emotional intelligence way, the way that we can kind of cognitively understand our own emotions, and then apply our moral kind of principles and behaviors in order to control that aggression, so we don't act aggressively. Okay. So Jay, yeah, you're saying, I get that, the cue knee-jerk reaction, I feel like a normal person wouldn't take it to the lengths of killing. However, frustration can lead a person to act aggressively. Oh, absolutely. You're absolutely right there. If just excuse me, it's so dry doing these lives. I need to have a glass of water with me. Yeah, this is a thing. If we look at some where people have acted out of character, you know, they've ended up really sort of angry. Maybe they've started drinking, and then they've acted completely out of character and attacked somebody. That would be, that's kind of what you're saying there, isn't it? And this is what excuse me. This is what Berkowitz is saying, is that we've got this kind of cognitive off switch, a braking system that can kind of divert us from taking aggressive action. Yeah, but again, it all depends on the situation, doesn't it? You know, it depends on the actual stimuli. I mean, if you think about it, if say somebody hurt your child, my goodness, it doesn't matter how much cognitive awareness you've got there, your immediate natural reaction would be to act aggressively towards the person who perpetrated that action towards your child. Yeah, but we then rein ourselves in with our cognitive awareness of right and wrong, effectively. So Berkowitz, so the cognitive neo-association, we're going to apply this to Gacy now. So we could actually argue that Gacy had no such cognitive awareness. So if we kind of look at his upbringing, he's not had the secure attachment. So kind of repeating myself a little bit what I did at the beginning of the lecture. So he's not navigated the stages of moral development. What role model has he had? He hasn't really had one there. He's not had that secure attachment with his father. It's kind of like what attachment he would have had with his mother would have kind of been influenced, possibly even impeded by his father, okay? Because he wouldn't have been able to, if his mother tried to defend him several times, but wasn't always able to do so because his father was that much of a brute, okay? So that's going to interrupt his attachment with his mother. It also would impede his attachment with his siblings as well to some degree. I've just talked ahead of myself there, but yeah, so basically the whole kind of cognitive awareness, his cognitive awareness compass, his moral compass. So if we think of Freud and the super ego, he's not able to form all of these important psychological and psychosociological kind of processes there. Okay, so Gacy's kind of like grown up with no off switch. Okay, just complete build up of frustration. Okay, so moral development, it needs secure attachment with the friends as well as family. Now, this is a really, really important one because we do really, as children, we make very deep attachments with others through friendship circles, okay? So Gacy had a heart condition, which actually meant he was unable to play with other children or kind of really take part in really active rough and tumble sports, okay? So he preferred the gardening or cooking because obviously that was a safer option for him, but he actually enjoyed doing that. So the lack of interaction with peers, so children of his own age, this would have impacted as well on his development regarding moral reasoning, because this is kind of like children kind of bounce off each other about right and wrong and fairness, when they're even through playing of games as well. Right, okay, so we're going to play a game of basketball and it's your turn now. And, you don't push in, you don't jump ahead because it's his turn. So this kind of, it sounds really, really simple, but these are parts of the moral development which children form about what is fair and what is right. So he didn't even get to participate in any of that. So he's really kind of like sailing his own boat in the middle of the ocean with nothing really to guide him as to which way to go, if we look at it like that. Okay. So Gacy again, if we think at the way that he was isolated through his childhood, okay, he's not able to form attachments with friends, with his siblings because of the way that his father was, with his mother, okay. The only kind of role model really, the family friend sexually assaulted him. So, nowhere is safe. What we need to kind of really understand is that the child's needs from birth is to feel safe. And Gacy, nothing was ever safe, okay? He did continuously kind of try and please his father and gain his father's approval. So Gacy's learning very quickly that actually the only way to control people or get people to do things for you, very similar to Manson, okay, is to be kind of violent, aggressive, and abusive, okay, because that means that you can meet your goals, okay, you can achieve your goals by being a violent, brutal bully, okay. So can we see just how negatively this influences Gacy's moral development? Okay, really just not good at all. He's got no safe island, as it were, to go to. So if anybody's done behaviorism, which I'm sure Emmy, you would have done behaviorism as well, operant and classical conditioning. Jay, I'm pretty certain you've heard of that or studied that at some point. So when we're looking at looking at serial killers, we're looking at operant conditioning as well, okay, in a very different way to what you might think, okay. So it gives us further insight as to Gacy's, I keep calling him Gary, Gacy's deliberate choice of victims. So those, so people who are unlikely to be missed. So this is quite common for serial killers, but not all, okay. It is a common theme. Gacy's victims were young males, many of whom were prostitutes, runaways, or travellers. Okay, so they're unlikely to be missed. Okay, it would take, it could even take weeks, months before they're reported as a missing person, especially if they're off travelling. Okay, it'll be like, oh, I haven't, and don't forget, back then we didn't have the internet, no mobile phones, so it would have been a postcard home. Okay, so it would have been many, many months, or a phone call. Many, many months before people would twig that that person is missing, and less so if they came from a disturbed or broken home, if they're escaping domestic violence, that kind of thing, okay, or if even they're care leavers, for example, if they've been in juvenile and they've been juvenile delinquency centres and been released, there wouldn't have been any support back then, okay. So these are young men that nobody would miss. So it gave Gacy plenty of time to do what he needed to do and dispose of them, and basically build his alibi, etc., before anybody noticed them missing. So the longer the time span, the less likely you are to find the killer, basically. So this kind of gives him a real head start, okay. So prior to his first murder, so this was during his first marriage, okay, when he was the president of the JC. So this was a kind of a political youth group. So he would invite, would have all these males join in the JC, so this kind of like youth group, and he would ply them with alcohol. So this is the kind of like temptation reward process in operant conditioning, okay. So he would do this prior to kind of committing sexual advances on these young men, okay, and if they said, oh, get off, or rebuffed him, he would just pass it off as a joke, okay. So he's learning here, if we look at operant conditioning, behaviorism, he's learning that actually to get somebody to do something, I've got to give a reward. If I give them, teenagers will they love alcohol, so I can actually really lure these people in with the reward. And it does get a little bit darker. In fact, I frightened myself researching this guy. He's absolutely the most dangerous psychopath. I actually, out of all of the serial killers, I would say that, they're all dangerous, obviously, and most of them are psychopaths. However, the depths that this man went to is just incredible. So Gacy's learning kind of evolves around violence towards vulnerable individuals. So, if we think about it, he was a vulnerable child of between 7 and 9 when he was sexually assaulted and abused by a family friend. Okay, so when we kind of look at this from operant conditioning, Gacy was conditioned that fierce, angry, violent, aggressive, demeaning kind of behavior achieved your objective. You met your goals, you achieved your goals, okay. He also learned that if you have that you then have a compliant victim, he will still try to please. Okay. So this is all kind of learned behavior from childhood and then going through into young adulthood, and his early days of when he ran the JCs. Okay. So he's learning, and the whole time he's learning, he's actually escalating. Okay. So if we remember the situation that he, from the first session, the situation he found himself in with the corpse when he went off to work at the morgue, and he actually got into the kind of the trail bed or whatever they use with this adolescent naked male corpse. Okay, and started cuddling it and caressing it. So he's apparently he didn't go any further, but we only have documented records of what Gacy is saying there. Okay, so we've got this build up, is escalation. Okay, so we've got our frustration aggression theory, we've got our operant conditioning, we've got our learned behavior from childhood, that actually if I'm really violent, if I'm aggressive, if I'm this, or if I use a reward, I can manipulate people, I can gain their trust. Okay, so this is where he's building. Okay, this is the most grimmest thing ever. Grim alert. If you find this too grim, do please close your ears right now. But it's actually really important to what I'm going to talk about next. Okay. So I also discovered that it is documented that with his first murder, which was when he was married to his first wife, he claimed to have experienced a significant sexual climax, which what that does is provided him with this kind of reward for the act of killing. Okay, so again, operant conditioning, but we've also crucially got the neurobiology cogs working here. We've got the release of reward neurotransmitters in the brain. So the physical act of killing then. So we've got this, because he experienced pleasure, heightened pleasure at committing a murderous act, that then creates neurons in the brain, which will transmit dopamine, and dopamine is our reward neurotransmitter. Okay, so just a quick, I won't go into this in detail here now, and I certainly do on my course. On my course on criminal psychology, I have a whole module dedicated to the biological approach and the neurobiology of criminology. Okay, so just giving you a quick overview. Yes, it is absolutely, Emmy. I totally agree with you. So scary, it is, and this is why I find this he's dead now, thank goodness. Incredibly dangerous, because there's so many different facets here. You know, we've not just got psychopathy, the learned behavior, you know, the kind of the trauma, the impact of the brain, the changes in the brain. We've got a dangerous psychopath who is now getting, you know, a neurochemical hit off not just the, you know, the rape and sexual assault of his victims at that point, but also in the torture and killing. Just ghastly, absolutely ghastly. So a quick overview of the brain's reward system. So we've got our ventral striatum. Now I'll give you a little bit of background into this one. This is, you know, your teenagers. Okay, so the prefrontal cortex, development of executive function, emotional regulation, impulse control. Now this one, ventral striatum, impulse. Okay, it's, if you think about it, it's the motivator of reward. Okay, so I want to do this, and you know, there's no, with the ventral striatum, it's all about the gain. Okay, so kind of think of it a bit like Freud's id. Okay, the ventral striatum is the id. Okay, so it's an excitable, it's all about the desire and wanting. Okay, so it influences the impact of the source of the reward. Okay, and the reward expectation, and it's in the main part of the basal ganglia. That's another. So within the brain areas, when we talk about the brain, we have several different areas and sub areas. Okay, so I just kind of simplified this as best I can. Now the ventral striatum in teenagers and the prefrontal cortex, they work together to tell the brain that actually we shouldn't act on this impulse. We shouldn't do this because we could injure ourselves really badly. We could even possibly kill ourselves or, hurt somebody else by accident, So this is why young males are really expensive to insure to drive cars. Okay, even though men think they're better drivers, they're not. This is why, because of this impulse control. At this point, the prefrontal cortex is still trying to negotiate with the ventral striatum and say, well, actually, no, you really shouldn't do that. And this is why. Okay. So this is the kind of hub, as it were. So if we look at John Wayne Gacy and the experience that he had when he committed his first murder, the ventral striatum was getting its hits from that. Okay. And it's going, yes, yes, yes. This is the reward that I wanted. I've now got my kind of hit of dopamine and I can pass this around to the other brain regions. Okay. So the prefrontal cortex. Okay. So this, again, like I said, development in adolescence, emotional regulation, impulse control, executive function. So when Berkowitz, when he's talking about cognitive neo-association, this is what he means. Okay. So the normal functioning, if the prefrontal cortex has developed properly and correctly in adolescence, it should stop the aggression spiraling out of control. In Gacy's case, what happened here was that the brain created more neurons, which then transmitted, so they transported the neurotransmitter dopamine, which gives the brain, it's like the brain's happy drug. Okay. And that's what makes, in his particular case, that would then propel his escalation. It would just completely propel his killing because he's getting a hit from it. Okay. And when Gacy disposed of his victims, it was like we said before, kind of under the crawl space of his home, and 4 victims were dumped in the Les Plaines river, rather. So we kind of like looked at Carl Jung and the unconscious, and we looked at Freud and the suppressed, kind of repressed memories, and thinking like, okay, so they're down below, they're in the unconscious. Okay. Now Gacy said that he dumped the other 4 in the river because he ran out of room. He just ran out of space under his house. Okay. So the other thing that we've got to look at with Gacy is that he was, when we're looking at criminal profiling and profiling of killers, so if there's a killer out there, they try and get a profile because they look at the crime scene. At the crime scene, there will be evidence of the psychological needs being met. Okay. I'm not going to go deep into that, but I'm sure you can, after what I've just been talking about, you'll get an idea. So they can kind of almost build a picture of who did this and what the victim typology is. So what I mean by that is, what type of victim do they go for? Who are they targeting? What's their hunting ground? What's their kind of radius for attracting their victims, killing their victims, disposing their victims, and then traveling back home and to work, etc. Now, the thing is with Gacy, he was a very articulate killer. You would call him, so in profiling, we look at organized versus disorganized. Okay, so organized killers are more times than ever, they're psychopaths. Okay, an organized killer plans, they know exactly what they're doing. They'll also build a relationship with the victim beforehand. So if we look at Gacy, he tried to build the relationships with his victims beforehand, by very early on, before he started escalating with the JCs. And then later, when he moved states or he moved towns or whatever, he then kind of cruised strips where young male prostitutes were, and he would get them back to his home on the pretext that, obviously alcohol, party, learning magic tricks, things like that. Okay, so he's very, very organized in his methods. So we would call him organized. Disorganized, generally sociopathic killers. There's sociopaths, so there's no attempt to build any relationship with the victim. It's all very frenzied and disorganized. They leave a mess. Okay, so that's our difference with profiling. So, and this is why Gacy is or was probably one of the most dangerous serial killers. I'm going to be talking tomorrow about dissociative identity disorder. And I just wanted to kind of clarify with, because I know, Emmy, you said last week, oh, I've just seen your comment, sorry. At that point, why would he stop? Exactly. Yeah. And I know that from last week you said about dissociative identity disorder, so previously known as multiple personality disorder. Now, Gacy, he tried to make out that he one of his many defenses, and there's so many, wherever he could shift blame, he did it. Okay, he tried to say that there were two of him. He tried to say, I think I can't remember the name of the alter. Another, I think it was Jake or something, or Jake Hannon or something like that. That he had this other, he would black out, because he did have blackouts as a child and a teenager. That was to do with his heart problem. So he tried to say that he had blackouts, and that this other alter, which he gave a name to, is the one that did the killing. Yeah. Tried to say he did not remember the killings. He then tried to so that's where they kind of like explored him for schizophrenia. That would be an obvious one to make sure, because they've got to take this man to trial. They need to kind of make sure that he's not going to plead on insanity. Okay. So he was examined and investigated for schizophrenia, multiple personality disorder, which it would have been known as that at the time. And that was a very kind of new disorder. So this is kind of like, if you think of the way that Gacy's he's tried to blame his victims. He's tried to say that it's someone else, that is another part of him, the bad John, the Jake, or whatever. I've got, and then there's several different alters, and I don't know which one did it. He's constantly blame shifting, even to the point where he's blaming his victims. It was really stupid of them to put them in that situation, themselves in that situation in the first place. So this is psychopathic behavior. Whatever way that he could find to shift responsibility for killing 33 young men, he would do it. That's our dear Gacy, the reward system. I've just been through this. The other thing I meant to say, and I've just noticed, this is why I've got my slides to remind me of things. The hippocampus. Now, the hippocampus in the brain is our brain's memory bank. It's where we store our memories. Okay, the hippocampus is situated right next to the amygdala, which is I'm going to be talking about trauma again. It is bizarre, absolutely. But like I said, the hippocampus is our memory bank. Amygdala is our fight or flight. Okay, so our memories, the way that we store our memories are kind of stored with information from the world around us. So our five senses are embedded into our memories, which is why sometimes that when you might like my daughter, she said the other day that the smell of a bouquet of flowers, a particular bouquet of flowers, made her think of her nana's house. Yeah, so that's a memory embedded with the sense of smell. Okay, so this is how we embed our memories. Okay, so when we're looking at Gacy and his dopamine release and the dopamine hits that he's getting, these are kind of memories that he's able to bring back and revisit. And this is another driver for him needing to go out and kill again. Okay. So the brain is an amazing organ, but it's also responsible for some very, very dark behavior. That concludes tonight's lecture, and I really hope you've enjoyed it. You've been able to follow along. As always, if there's anything that you really don't understand, you think, actually, Kath, I'm stuck there, I really didn't get what you meant, do please put it in the comments, message me, and I'll do my very best to explain it to you. So next week, I'm kind of beginning to wonder whether I might need 4 sessions for this guy, but I think probably 3 is enough for me. Next week, I'm going to be looking at the 4 facets of psychopathy. Now, I'm always talking about psychopathy and how it's a trait theory. We're looking at traits rather than a set of behaviours, which we get with antisocial personality disorder. Okay. So I really want to talk about the 4 facets of psychopathy, how we can recognize that, the contribution to criminal psychology, particularly within serial killers, the differences between psychopathy and sociopathy, and also why antisocial personality disorder, why it's, although it's kind of like a catch-all for psychopathy and sociopathy, why it kind of it sits as a standalone, because you can have a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder and not be a serial killer. Okay, you don't necessarily have to kill somebody. It can be projected outwards to things like embezzlement and fraud and kind of exploitation of other people. Yeah. Oh yes, Amy. Thank you very much. I'm really glad you're enjoying the sessions. Okay, right. So next week, 4 facets of psychopathy. And again, what we'll be doing is we're going to be looking at what we know about John Wayne Gacy. I've got some more information to go into next week's lecture about him. So we can really I can teach you what psychopathy is and how we can identify that in John Wayne Gacy. So if we can apply it to somebody in the real world, and hopefully you'll start to see what I mean by psychopathy and kind of the recognition of the traits, etc. Anyway, so hopefully see you next week. It should be, when I say the next week, it should actually be on the Saturday at 7:30. So that's the end of this week. I do apologise for the rescheduling this week, but there was something else very big on at the weekend and I wasn't able to do this. So hopefully see you on Saturday. If there's any change, I will let you know. Tomorrow night, don't forget, dissociative identity disorder. Okay, so I'm going to be doing a session at 7:30 on that. So hopefully see you there. Thank you very much and take care, and don't have nightmares.